When it comes to SharePoint, I'm always looking for ways to do better automation. I can't stand doing manual tasks when I know that there's ways that I can be more efficient by setting up workflow. In this video, I'm going to talk to you about creating a special Power Automate workflow that will let you automate the process of creating fields in a SharePoint list. The reason this is important is because sometimes we have to create a lot of fields in a SharePoint list, and it can be very time consuming to have to create those manually. Linked below the video is an article which will show you how to set up this complete workflow that I'm going to show in the video. So now, let's get SharePoint smart. Okay, here I am in my SharePoint Online site. I set up a test list called tracking just to demonstrate what I'm doing here. So at times when I'm creating a SharePoint list, I've got to make a whole bunch of fields, or I need to update a list to add a whole bunch of fields. And normally the way I'm going about that is either by adding columns to the UI here, which is fine when I'm just doing a few fields, or I'm in the list settings screen and I'm adding fields there. But what about when you need to add 30 or 40 or 50 fields, and maybe there's a lot of them that are the same settings? I'd like a way to do that efficiently, and that's what we're going to learn about in this video. So I have a workflow which I've created in Power Automate to batch generate fields. I can create a whole set of fields by just kicking off one workflow. To start out, I'm going to demonstrate how it works, and then we'll go into the setup and talk about how that can be done on your end. So I'm going to run this workflow, and what you're going to see is that this workflow has several input parameters. These are parameters that I'm going to enter every time I want to add fields to a list. So in this case, I've got a list called tracking, and one thing I need at the beginning is to copy the URL of the list where I'm going to add those fields. So I just paste that in as the first step, and then I've set it up to handle all of the main types of fields that we create in SharePoint. So I'm just going to demonstrate with single line of text, and then it asks me all those typical questions that I'm asked whenever I'm normally creating a field one at a time. Some of these are optional, some required. I, of course, need to provide the field names. These are going to be comma delimited. So what I do is just put a series of fields, and I can just use commas to separate those. And I can do as many as I want to. In my demonstration, I'm just going to do 2 so that I can save some time when I show it to you. But the idea here is I could do 20 or 30 or whatever count I need to do. So I need to indicate how many fields. I'm entering the field count number, and then need to indicate whether it's required. Optionally, I can include description or default, but those are not fields that I have to put in. So I'll go ahead and run that flow, and it's running right now, and this should go pretty quick. All right, it's still running. All right, it's done. So now I can go back to my list settings screen, and I should see those new fields that were created. There they are, task 1 and task 2. Now, that's not very exciting, but what you want to understand here is that when I run this flow, I can have it trigger as many fields as I need to by just using those input parameters. Now we're going to dive into the flow itself and take a look at how this works. What's great about this is you can use this across your entire SharePoint environment. As long as you're a SharePoint admin and you have rights, you have permissions rights on all of those lists, you can use this workflow repeatedly. I don't have to make another workflow for another site or anything like that. So I'm going to walk through and talk to you about how this works, and then you can follow the steps in the article linked below the video to set up this same workflow yourself. This is a instant cloud flow, and it's using a manual trigger, and I've added these inputs. These are input fields in order to be prompted for key information when I start the workflow. So that's what we have in this block at the top. It's asking for all these values, the list URL, the type of field, which I've made a drop-down picker, and then information such as whether the field's required. And then in some situations, like choice fields, we need a comma-delimited list of values for the drop-down for the choice field. So that all goes in the top block, and then after that, our workflow begins, and it needs to do some work for us. It's going to parse out the site address from the URL provided for the list, and then it's going to parse out the list name. These snippets of code are provided to you in the instructions, which are linked below. After that, we need a couple of variables. One's going to count based on the number of fields we're creating. We need a loop counter, so that's called int loop count. And then we need a very similar field, which is used as a reference when I'm creating fields. That's called int field index. At that stage, it's ready to go into the loop. So we have a do until loop block, and it's going to go through this loop based on the number of fields that I'm created. It'll go through one time for each field that I'm creating. Now, right at the top of this, we have to increment that loop counter. So that's really easy. We just add 1 every time it goes through the loop. And then our field index is 0 base. So we need to have 1 less than the loop count, and we're going to store that in the field index variable. At that stage, we're ready to go. So let me collapse those. And what you're going to see are 11 blocks here that are very similar to each other. It is the code to create each of those types of fields. So we'll look at one of the examples. If the field type is single line of text, in all cases, we're going to be creating fields by using the send an HTTP request to SharePoint. So this method sends a block of code which will tell SharePoint to create the field with the specified parameters. We're going to be referencing the variables from the top of the flow. So that includes the site address, the name of the list, and then some parameters that go into the command that's going to be sent to SharePoint. So some of the things from above, we need to get the referenced field that's based on that field index. If you'll recall, there's a comma delimited list of fields we're giving to the workflow. And then it's passing whatever we've given for whether it's required, whether it has a default value in a description, and so on. As you might imagine, these are very similar to each other. So for example, the multi-line plain text looks nearly identical, but what you'll see is that in the code, it references that special field type. And then also you'll see this property called field type kind, which has an integer. So this is all based on Microsoft's API for updating SharePoint lists. And all of those code snippets are in the instructions. So you, unlike me, don't have to go through the hassle of looking up all those different references and making sure you have everything that you need to do things to create each of these special types of fields. As an example, the choice field has some special parameters, so it needs to pass along the choices using a special format. And that's all covered in the instructions that are linked. So it's going to go through this loop for as many fields as you need. Now, the workflow is set to create one type of field at a time. So just as an example, if I needed to create a series of 10 choice fields, I would select choice and say I want 10 fields and give it the parameters for that. And then if in addition I need to add more fields to the list, maybe I need 10 yes, no fields in addition to that, I'll just run the workflow again for that next field type. So it's going to handle one field type at a time for you. There are links at the bottom of the instructions if you want to read more about the different properties for the REST API and different options that you have. This workflow is designed to run for normal use cases. So I think we all know sometimes we have to create a very special SharePoint field or something that's very unique, and there can be different properties that we might select or turn on for a particular field. Just for the sake of efficiency, this workflow doesn't try to accommodate every single scenario that's going to take place. It's covering the things that are typical, especially in the case where we're using a repeated series of fields that are all similar in nature. You certainly can easily modify this workflow to add more input parameters. You may want to have other properties. You may find that you want to do some more things with your SharePoint fields that are beyond these normal use cases, and it should be straightforward to use those API references to modify that workflow to work how you want. So you're going to go through in your SharePoint environment, well, I should say your Power Automate environment, and you're going to build this incrementally. So you just go through in sequence and follow these steps, and it's going to tell you how to do all the things that I just showed on my screen, starting right at the beginning when you create the manually triggered flow, which is an instant cloud flow. So it's going to walk you through all the steps, and it has screenshots so you can go through. One thing I recommend is that you test your workflow as you're building it. This is certainly a more sophisticated workflow, and you're going to want to make sure you're on the right track as you go along. So when you get to the first type of field, which is the text field, you're going to want to go ahead and run a test on your workflow and make sure that you put in all those code snippets correctly, you made all the correct references, and the workflow is doing what you expect. And then you can move on to the next step. In general, once you've got it working for one field, you're going to find that it follows a similar pattern, and it's going to be pretty straightforward to continue on with these directions to add each of the different field types. So that's it. This is a workflow that allows you to do batch field generation entirely through this one Power Automate workflow. And for SharePoint administrators, this is something that you might have otherwise done with PowerShell scripting. And that certainly is also efficient. One possible downside there is it's requiring me to make code updates. I may have to adjust those scripts, and it may be time consuming to do that each time I want to create a new set of list fields for a different site, for example. So this is a way for you to possibly replace that approach and not need to use PowerShell scripting for this kind of a scenario. So I hope you found this useful. This set of instructions is at SharePoint Dashboards. It's linked below the video. And for those of you guys who use Power Automate, this is a great tool to add to your toolbox to help automate and make you more efficient when it comes to making SharePoint lists and adding batches of fields. Good luck.